Today we've got Barry speaking. Barry Milne is the director of Compass Research Centre, as many of you will know. He has a master's degree in psychology from the University of Otago and a PhD in psychiatric epidemiology from King's College London. His main interests are in life course research, survey research, and the use of administrative data to answer policy and research questions. Today, he will be talking about work currently underway to simulate the impacts of policy interventions.
Thank you, Natalia, and kia ora koutou. I'm going to be talking today about something that we at Compass have been working on for nearly 20 years now, led by Peter Davis. Started off on this track, and I sort of joined about 10 years ago working on some of these projects. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what microsimulation is, how it's being used around the world a bit, and then in New Zealand and what we've done at Compass over the past 20 years, and then focus in on a model that we're working on at the moment in relation to the Better Start Natural Science Challenge. So this work is funded as part from the Better Start Natural Science Challenge, and it is modeling some of the interventions that have been developed as part of the Better Start Natural Science Challenge. So just to acknowledge everyone who's been involved here. So I'm going to be talking about simulation related to, so the Better Start Natural Science Challenge, sorry, just to give you some context, aims to improve the health and well-being of children aged from 0 to 24-year-olds, a 10-year project beginning in 2016, or 8-year project, I suppose, finishing middle of this year, and 3 main substantive themes: successful learning about education, healthy weight, and resilient teens about mental health. So each of them had a intervention that they are working on. The healthy weight one I'm going to talk about actually preceded Better Start Natural Science Challenge, and this sort of lists off all the people that have been involved in those what we call themes in the Better Start Natural Science Challenge. So successful learning, Gail Gillen, Bridget O'Neill, and Megan Gath have been helping me with the Better Start Literacy approach. That's the intervention, if you like, that they've been working on. Healthy weight, Rachel Taylor worked on prevention of overweight infancy study, and that's what we've worked that into the simulation model as well as some work that Sarah Mason has been doing on smoking and pregnancy. And this is a work in progress, as I'll explain to you, but we're also working in one of the digital inventions that the Habits team here at the University of Auckland have been working on, one called Stress Less. And I'll talk a bit about that later, and work on that has been undertaken by a lot of people, including Carolina Stasiak, Sarah Hetrick, and Ruth Williams. In terms of the modelling we've been doing, the modelling I'm going to describe has been put together by Kevin Chang and Eileen Lee, but I also want to acknowledge Chris Ball at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, who helped us with the method to get a synthetic data set released from the Stats New Zealand data lab, essentially, to give us a starting population for a simulation. I'll explain why that's important. And through the years, lots of people listed there at Compass have helped out with the simulation modeling. Oliver and Jessica putting together the programming, really, to allow the simulation to work. Nicola and Steph worked on some simulations of the knowledge lab of the early life course. Roy, Janet, and Peter and Martin have worked on lots of different models at that point and prior to that point as well. Okay, so the basic idea here is, or the basic problem that we want simulation for, is we want to evaluate the impact of a policy change or an intervention. And you could just do the policy change and an intervention and then wait to see whether it works or not, but that's probably cost a lot of money, and it may not have worked, and so you waste a lot of people's time. So the idea is simulation, which doesn't have to be microsimulation. I'll talk about microsimulation is specifically, but simulation offers the possibility to model interventions on a virtual world. So you create a virtual world that looks as much as you can like the real world, and that you run little experiments on it. And if you do your job well, you can model the complexity and multiplications, associations, pathways that go on in the real world. It's always going to be a simplification, but hopefully you do a pretty reasonable job here. Okay, so microsimulation, the micro means we're simulating micro level units, which could be people, it could be businesses, could be any other individual thing. So the idea is we have a collection of individual things, in our case, people, in our simulation model. And we simulate each of them. So each of them can take a different path, and you simulate it a number of times, as I'll get onto in the next couple of slides. And the path that each individual unit takes can change across those different runs. And you average across runs to get a sense of what's going on. So typically you use empirical data as a basis to simulate real or alternative worlds in their futures. Or if you don't have empirical data for how you think the world might work, you can make plausible guesses and plug that into your simulation model. And the advantage of it is you've got this virtual lab set up that you can run experiments on. And the world is your oyster to that extent. You can run whatever experiment you like on it. To create this virtual world, in this case, a virtual world of individual people, we start with a real, or at least realistic, sample of people. And for the models that I've been working on over the past, I suppose, 10 years at Compass, have always started with a synthetic population of New Zealanders. So we make up people that look like real people in New Zealand, but aren't actually real people in New Zealand. And then we use that as the basis of a simulation, and we simulate what happens to them over time and run some experiments on that. And simulate what happens over time. So that's where we apply the stochastically derived rules to reproduce patterns via stochastic process. So different things may happen each time you do it for different individuals, because it's based more or less on probabilities. So people run through the simulation, and at various points along the track, they have different probabilities of things happening to them, or them being a certain way, probabilities of them being a certain way, and they may or may not be a certain way, or something may or may not happen to them, and based on that, that might take them on a different path. At this point, you've got a virtual world. And what you can do is predict what might happen if conditions were to change in that virtual world by altering the parameters in a certain way. So consider this simple made-up example. Suppose every child born has the same probability of attending early childhood education, and that probability is 0.5. They've got a 50-50 chance of attending or not attending. But based on whether or not they do attend, they've got a different probability of leaving school with qualifications. If they do attend, they've got an 80% chance of leaving school with qualifications. And if they don't, they've only got a 50% chance. And as I'll stress, this is made up just for the purpose of showing you the type of thing that microsimulation does. These sorts of things, the 0.5s and the 0.8s, are called transition probabilities. The probabilities that drive the change from one state to another state. And ideally, they should represent real transitions, real probabilities in the real world. These ones, as I say, are made up. And it's a stochastic process, so it's random, so you get different results each time. So on each simulation run, different units may be simulated as both attending early childcare education or not, and leaving school with qualifications or not. So imagine two individuals, Abby and Brian. They both start with the same probability of attending early childhood education. That's part of the model. It's 50-50 chance. So we roll the dice and see how it comes up. And on this particular run, Abby is simulated as going to early childhood education and Brian is not. Then based on that, they've got a different probability of leaving school with qualifications. Abby's is 0.8 and Brian's is 0.5. And then we simulated that again, and Abby's got an 80% chance, ends up she does. Brian's got a 50% chance, ends up he doesn't. And that's the way it works on that particular run. But if we do it a second time, we may get different results. So starting off with the same probabilities, the 0.5 for going to early childhood education. Suppose this time both were simulated as not going to early childhood education. 50-50 chance. It means now they've got a 50-50 chance of leaving school with qualifications. And on this particular run, the way the dice have been rolled, Brian ends up leaving school with qualifications and Abby doesn't. Okay, so that's kind of the way it works. In this case, we're going to get two runs and two individuals. But you can imagine a situation where thousands of individuals and lots of runs. And the deal is that it's best to take a number of runs and average. And this is a really simple example that I just did in Excel. But for 5 runs and 20 units, I got an average of 10.2 out of 20 attending ECE. The expected value there is 10, right? 50%. And then on that basis, 13.2 out of 20 left school with qualifications. Now, this is where the virtual lab part comes in. Suppose an intervention is suspected to increase the probability of children attending ECE to 0.8. So there might be a policy intervention that funds early childhood education places, for instance. But the probability of leaving school with qualifications remains the same, contingent on whether or not they attended early childhood education. 0.8 for attenders, 0.5 for non-attenders. What would happen if we implemented that policy change? So we run it through again, 5 runs in the 20 units that we've developed, Abby and Brian and 18 others. Before, we had 13.2 out of 20 leaving school with qualifications. After the change, that shifts up to 14.8 out of 20. An 8 percentage point increase. Okay, so that's an estimate of the effect of that policy change on something way down the track, leaving school with qualifications, based on those made up probabilities there. But you can imagine this with real probabilities in there and a lot more complex model as well. So a very simple model for which simulation is probably not needed, but I took you through that to show you an example of how microsimulation works. It does work on the basis of transition probabilities, but that can be generated in a number of different ways. This was just a roll of the dice. And in others we use, and the ones that we use, we tend to use regression type models. And they're also, you also might simulate not just binary events such as going to early childhood education or leaving school with qualifications, but something continuous like an income or something like that. You can imagine using that as your starting point, building a model around that had lots of different factors that affect ECE attendance and association with school qualifications through lots of different pathways. And microsimulation allows you to capture this in one model and allows counterfactuals to be tested. Just taking a step back here at the moment, microsimulation doesn't tell you about what the probabilities are for attending ECE or leaving school with qualifications. It'll simulate what you give it. So all those parameters that you need for your model, you have to get from somewhere else. This is the tool to crunch things through to see how things turn out in different situations. So how's it being used? I recently just scanned the International Journal of Microsimulation just to get some examples of the types of things microsimulation are being used for. Often there's an economic focus. I should say that it developed Guy Orcott, early 50s, I think, economist, developed the technique of microsimulation. So it still does have quite a role to play in just working out what things cost. So this example here, someone, I don't think they're based in the UK actually, but they simulated the cost of basic income in the United Kingdom. So simulated what might happen under various situations in terms of what a basic income would cost, and I guess how that might affect people's engagement in the workforce and the tax they pay. Another one based in the UK, so a dynamic microsimulation model of aging and health, for aging and health. And this is a common one, actually. There's a lot of microsimulation models on focused on retirement, particularly, and around retirement, sort of aging and the health implications of aging. And Compass, I worked on a few models like that as well. And then just the final example there, simulations of policy responses during the COVID-19 crisis in Argentina. So there are various policies, I guess, were being considered in Argentina, and this simulated through what those policies might do in terms of important socioeconomic indicators for the Argentinian population. So that's just gives you a flavor of the types of thing that microsimulation has been used for. It is used relatively widely, I would say, in New Zealand. I'm just going to run through 4 examples, but there are more than these. And this is based on a paper being put together at the moment by Sarah Pinto and Verity Warren about the current state of microsimulation models in New Zealand. And thank you, Sarah and Verity, for allowing me to use some of these descriptions. So this is the one that's probably, I would guess, is probably most used in New Zealand, the Tower model, the tax and welfare analysis. It's basically a model based on the Household Economic Survey of the taxes that people pay. And it monitors the effect on potential policy changes on individuals and what they will earn and what they will pay. and scaling up those results so that they're representative of the New Zealand population. So this ran out of the Treasury. The MSIM model ran out of the Ministry of Social Development. It's essentially modeling the benefit system. So it simulates eligibility and payments for both past and current MSD clients, and will run scenarios about if there was a particular change that will affect benefit and eligibility of payments, who would win and who would lose out of that, and what would it cost the country, essentially. The Monty model, which I think is still in development at the Ministry of Transport, is modelling the travel movements of 10% of the New Zealand population across a 24-hour period. And I think wants to do interesting things with it. It aims to answer how a particular policy change that might affect traffic, for instance, is expected to affect travel behaviour, one, but also the social environmental impacts of such a change. Okay, so as long as you've got reasonable guesses for each of those things, you can use a simulation model to give you the answers. And just finally, Te Ara Putama Mō Te Reo Māori, which is put together by Te Matawai, which is I think a community group that's promoting the Te Reo language. Te Taura Whiri I Te Reo Māori, which is the Māori Language Commission and the Ministry of Education. And what they are doing is forecasting the number of Te Reo Māori speakers from now through to 2040, to understand who is speaking to Te Reo Māori and where, as well as how certain policies or interventions to revitalise the Te Reo language might affect the number of speakers and where they're speaking the language. Okay. And then, as I say, at Compass, we've had a 20-year or so history of putting together simulation models. May have preceded this one. I'll give you an example of 6 or so, but first couple on aging. So primary care in the Aging Society with Peter Davis, Roy Leahy, and Janet Pearson. That was simulating the practitioner's system response to an aging society. And then building from that, there was the balance of care in the aging society, and that was when I first joined Compass, that was still being finalised, that model. And what that model wanted to look at is the extent to which the balance of care, so whether or not care is provided by the home, informal care, or provided by something that the state has to pay for, or someone has to pay for, retirement homes, etc. And given that in association with aging and age-related mortality, how the balance of informal care versus formal care can lessen the impact of those conditions and the cost of those conditions on the health system. Modelling the early life course, that's the first one that I became involved with. And it was also the first one we actually started to put these models into a computer program that you can kind of play around with and present to people and show them and say, hey, have a look at this. You can play around with the parameters here. That modeled children from age 0 to 13 using data from the Needham Christchurch development studies and the Pacific Island family studies, with some input also from the Te Hoi Nukuroa Best Outcomes for Māori study, to look at outcomes in the early life course and what may impact them in terms of healthcare attendance, conduct problems, and there's an education one. I can't remember what the education one was now. And then we kind of built on that for the knowledge lab of the early life course. And this is one where this is still running. It's a bit out of date, but it's still running. So you can go to that link there and play around with it. There's actually a user's guide built in there as well. So that extended the MEL-C model through to age 21. But rather than using estimates that we derive from analysing longitudinal studies, we use best estimates from systematic reviews to generate the transition probabilities essentially from one state to another state. And then as part of his, or for his, in fact, James Cook Fellowship, Peter Davis led the New Zealand as a Social Laboratory model, which again, you can have a look at there. And that modelled the New Zealand population from 1981 to 2006. And tested a series of policy counterfactuals based on the policies that were implemented during that time in New Zealand, and what if they weren't implemented as fully as they as they had been done. And a book became of that, Simulating Societal Change. Crikey, that must be 5 or 6 years ago now, that book was released. And then this one, the Better Start, what we're calling the Better Start model, which I'm going to talk about for the rest of the presentation now. And as I mentioned at the start, the idea of this was to take some of the some of the interventions that were developed as part of the Better Start Natural Science Challenge and put them into a microsimulation model. And on top of that, not part of the microsimulation model, outside of it, you can look at things like costs. So what are the costs of these interventions and what sort of cost savings would there be? Okay, so this is pretty much what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the presentation. Okay, so as I mentioned, the Better Start Natural Science Challenge has 3 substantive themes. I should mention the 4th one, of course, because I lead it, which is called the Big Data theme. So we sit across the other 3 substantive themes: successful learning, healthy weight and resilient teams, to run some mostly whole population analysis, but do other things such as simulation here, to answer important questions in relation to successful learning, healthy weight and resilient teens. And what we aim to build into this model, and we've done 3 of the 4 so far, is 1 for successful learning. So Gail Gillen and Bridget McNeil have developed the Better Start Literacy approach there at the University of Canterbury, which I'll go into shortly, but it's an approach that improves early literacy and, in fact, does a really good job of improving early literacy. And we're modeling both that and its effect on later reading comprehension. There has been consternation over the past 3 or 4 years, but I think it's been bubbling for a while about the sort of declining performance of New Zealand school children. And the one was reported last year on the progress of early reading and literacy, the New Zealand's poor results there. So we actually programmed in a representative distribution of those scores and got an estimate of the extent to which early literacy affects that, and that forms part of the microsimulation model. For healthy weight, some analyses Sarah Mason did with Wayne Cutfield, looked at the impact of smoking in pregnancy on obesity. And then there's an intervention that Rachel Taylor developed called the Prevention of Overweight in Infancy. Had several arms to it, but the sleep intervention was the one that had the biggest, or had an impact really. So we programmed that into the model. And then one that we are in the process of putting into the model is the stress-less digital intervention as part of the Resilient Teens, part of the Better Start Natural Science Challenge, as I said, and that's led by the habits team at Psychological Medicine here at the University of Auckland. And they've shown some impacts on well-being. Okay, so if you were to go to that link at the bottom, you'll see this. This is the Better Start. I've got things covering my screen, but it's essentially the Better Start model. And it lists off the 4 things that I just run through there that are being modeled here: the literacy approach, the 2 on obesity, and the 1 on well-being. And off to the left-hand side at the top, you can see the different tabs you can go to, and I'll show you snippets of each of these tabs as I go through and show you what we are doing with this. Okay, so this is the model input tab, for instance. And it basically shows you the types of things that we're modeling. So for literacy, we've got the Better Start literacy approach affecting early literacy, and that in turn affecting literacy in middle childhood. And in terms of obesity, we've got smoking during pregnancy, that's impact on obesity. I'm not going to show you that one actually. And also the POI, sleep intervention, prevention of overweight and infancy sleep intervention, and its effect on obesity. This is not, I'm not showing you this live, I'm showing this is just a screenshot, but if you were to hover over those arrows there, you'll get a sense of the estimates that we've derived or have used. And if you click on the arrow, then you get taken either to a paper that describes where we got the estimate from, or in some of those cases, analyses that have been done that show how we populated the model. So it's kind of inbuilt documentation. Okay, so the Better Start literacy approach is something that's been developed over the past 6 or 7 years, or maybe even more, by Gail Gillen and others at the University of Canterbury. And it focuses on the systematic teaching of phonological awareness and letter sound knowledge, and it's training teachers to train these skills in basically new entrants to school. So there's a quote there from Gail Gillen from one of the papers describing this approach. Teachers monitor children's response to the Better Start literacy approach teaching and then scaffold, adapt activities or increase teaching intensity as necessary to ensure all children progress towards the next step for learning. And you can find out more through that link there. And analyses we did as part of the big data thing showed that it had really impressive results here. So what we've got here is kids who've been through the program, they're in the red, and kids who haven't, but are the same age of those kids who've been through the program. So you've got the age in months going along the bottom from 60 months, which is 5 years, to 72 months, which is 6 years. You see those who've been through 10 weeks of the program leap ahead in terms of the proficiency in identifying sounds within words, essentially. So phonemes within words, in cat, that sort of thing. In fact, they reach at 5.5 what the kids who haven't been through it don't quite reach by 6 years of age. So there's at least a sort of 6 months advance there. And it has an impact on children of all ethnicities and all deprivation groups. This is being implemented widely at the moment, I should say. So it's this sort of stuff that we've programmed into the model. We did sort of more detailed analysis that I'm showing you here, or at least Megan Gaff did, and sent those analyses to us, and that's what's being put in the model. So the other thing is that gets you the arrow from Better Start literacy approach to early literacy. The other thing is there's a paper. I said, well, okay, can you give me point me to any evidence showing that this early literacy has long-term effects? And they said, yes, look at this paper here. And this paper here shows that depending on your early literacy, your early literacy has a 0.39 correlation with your later literacy. Okay, so it has long-term effects. So the idea is if we improve early, assuming causality here, idea is if we improve early literacy through the Better Start literacy approach, that will have longer-term effects to reading comprehension, essentially in middle childhood. Reading comprehension is the thing that New Zealand was shown to be poor on many things, but poor on as part of the PEARLS evaluation that was last year or the year before. So we programmed that in from a paper. Okay, so this is what's called the scenario builder part of the model. So if you look to the right-hand side first, we've selected the Better Start literacy approach, or go to the left-hand side, sorry, step 2. Select variable to examine, Better Start literacy approach. Now go to the far right. The default setting is no one has been through this program yet. And the way you can play around with this is put a certain number of children through this program. So that's what we've done. 50% go through. So imagine 50% of New Zealand children go through the program. This is what we're modeling. And then we run the scenario. Based on that, so these phonological awareness scores, which go up to 20, you can see, and I've broken this out by ethnicity to show that it has effects on children of all ethnic groups. The orangey red dots with the error bars there are what is before we make any change. That's what's called the base scenario. So before we make the change to have 50% of the children go through the program, that's what their level of phonological awareness is. And then once you run the scenario where 50% of them gone through the program, remember we saw those dramatic effects before, that's programming those effects in. And here are the flow-on effects to reading comprehension later. So based on the fact that we're estimating that there's a 0.39 correlation between phonological awareness in early childhood and later reading comprehension, that's the effects you would expect to see from putting random 50% of the population through the Better Start literacy assessment. Okay, but maybe that's not the way you want to do it. What about a tailored intervention? So what I did before is put 50% of the whole population through, or put them through and said that they got the Better Start literacy approach. But what we could do instead is we're going to target and actually just put 50% of children who meet certain criteria. In this case, based on deprivation. So we're going to target it to the most deprived children in the country. That's based on the children's deprivation status. So that's the deprivation status of the house they live in. It's not the same as a school decile, which has been discontinued anyway. That will be another way to do it. But this is based on the child, because that's the easiest thing we could actually get when we got the base file out. We could get their deprivation. So this intervention doesn't target the whole population. It just targets those who live in deprivation quintile 5, so the lowest 20% of households. And what happens there? So this is when we this is when we put 50% of all children through. And this is when we put 50% of children in the lowest deprivation quintile through. So you can see still an effect, but the biggest effect in Māori and Pacific children, mainly because areas of New Zealand that are in the lowest quintile of deprivation tend to have a disproportionately large number of Māori and Pacific children. So inadvertently, those children are being focused on for this particular intervention. Okay, so that's the Better Start Literacy approach and how the microsimulation model models that, and you can target it to different sectors of the population. In terms of the POI study, the prevention of overweight in infancy, which was a randomized controlled trial, which had 4 arms. I think there was a food and nutrition, information, sleep, both, and then nothing. That's the 4 arms. The background here is there's a high prevalence of overweight and obesity in childhood in New Zealand and elsewhere. Work that we have done actually as part of the Better Start National Science Challenge has shown is that preschool obesity at least is going down in all groups in New Zealand. There are long-term health consequences of obesity. So obesity even early on tracks to obesity later, and consequent health, particularly cardiovascular health risk factors in later adolescence and early adulthood. It's hard to change once established. So the question is, can you do something early on that will change the track for children? Short sleep has been associated with increased weight. So what a sleep intervention that aims to increase the sleep duration, reduce overweight and obesity in childhood. And it turns out, if you read this paper here from Rachel Taylor and others, it does. It halves the odds of obesity in those receiving the intervention compared to those who got nothing. So we can program it in here. So this is now the model builder part here. And this actually just shows you the model that we put together. So that's the full model actually. And when we finalize this, I think we're just going to show the things that you're able to change, which would be in this case the sleep intervention. So you can see that's an odds ratio there of 0.5086. And what we're going to do here is run another scenario. This time we're going to focus on the POI sleep intervention. Over to the right-hand side again, you can see that the base is that no one has been through this intervention. And what we're going to do is put, for the sake of argument, again, put half the population through this intervention. Want to see what would happen. Okay, so that's the results just for the full population now. You can see the prevalence of obesity dropped by about 1.5 percentage points as a result of this intervention. That's just faithfully representing what this paper suggested the intervention does. But another thing that you can do with the way we developed this microsimulation model, and this is actually a new thing, this is the first time we've done this with the simulation models that we've developed, is, I wish I could read that. Can't read it because it's all up there. What if the effect size is actually different and typically smaller than the research indicates? So it's a classic thing where people run a great intervention study and they estimate the effect size will be a certain type, and when they put into the real world, a certain size, and when they put into the real world, it's far smaller than that size. Because the real world tends to be a bit more messy than controlled conditions of a particular randomized controlled trial, as was run for the POI study. So you can just go in and change it here. So what I've highlighted there is the odds ratio that we got directly from that paper from Rachel Taylor about the effect of the POI sleep intervention. And we're going to just change it to 0.8. We're saying it's the odds ratio, it doesn't halve it, it only reduces it by 20%. And what's the impact there? And over onto the sort of middle of the screen, you have to calibrate intercepts, otherwise kind of the prevalence of, in this case, obesity goes off on a different track than it should do, but worked out a way mathematically to change the effect size here and have it feed through to the simulation. So that's what we had before with the odds ratio of 0.5. If you change it to 0.8, you can see a far smaller effect. Okay, so take these two things together. We can tailor an intervention to certain parts of the population, and we can change the effect size that we program in there. That means you can do certain things. We're saying, well, okay, this intervention, it seems to work quite well across the board for children from different deprivation groups and children of different ethnicities, but I don't think it's going to work so well for these children. You can then, don't show you an example of this, but you can actually then target a particular subgroup of the population and change what the estimated effect size is for them. If you have reason to expect, or you just want to test, that there might be a smaller effect size for that group. Okay, so that's what we've modeled so far. I'll just talk a little bit about what we're in the process of modeling at the moment, and this will be ready to run within the next month, I would think. So the habits team have created a number of different digital interventions, a lot of chatbots, but other things as well. They actually developed one during COVID. Was the one called during COVID Araha? I'm not sure, but anyway, they developed one during COVID. One of the set is called Stress Less. It was called Stress Detox when they first put it out there. So it's a chatbot. So you chat with it. You've sort of daily contact with it. So it's a 21-day program based on cognitive behavioral therapy and positive psychology. So the chatbot messages the user via the messenger once a day, and the user, I think, says the time of the day that they want to be messaged and guides them through a brief daily activity for 21 days. And they looked at this paper by Ruth Williams and others, and showed that it improved well-being, WHO-5 well-being they measured in 18 to 24-year-old students. So just to give you a bit more detail of this, and as I say, well, I'm not going to show you any results of the modeling because we haven't done the modeling yet, but just to give you a bit of a sense of what it does. This is, I think, that when you first kind of get the chatbot, and the chatbot introduces itself to you and asks what your name is, and then interacts with you as you go on. So these are kind of the 21-day things that they go through, and the first week is focused on physiological sensations associated with stress and anxiety, and then the week 2 they focus on cognitive appraisal of stress and anxiety, and in week 3 the behavioral response. And going through this, what they find is that there's a reasonably sized improvement in the well-being of people who've been through the program, and that's what we're going to be modeling as part of the Better Start model. Okay, that's pretty much what I wanted to cover today, and I think I've left us a good amount of time for questions. Microsimulation is a flexible way to test the impact of policies and interventions. Lots of different ways to do things. As I say, there's a lot of times have a economic focus and haven't done things exactly the same way that we've done them, but they all boil down to, in a sense, in one way, shape, or form, transition probabilities. The Better Start model tests interventions developed as part of the Better Start National Science Challenge. So the two I showed you were the Better Start literacy approach on phonological awareness and later reading comprehension, and the POI prevention of overweight in infancy sleep intervention, and also models in there the impact of smoking in pregnancy on obesity. To do is the Stress Less digital intervention, and you can target interventions, you can modify effect sizes, and it's all in a, I didn't say this actually, but it's actually displayed in our Shiny. So it's a Shiny app that once you press a button in the Shiny app, it goes through and does a simulation in the background and then spits the answers back at you. Those graphs I was showing you were the results of pressing a button to do the simulation running, and then that being spat back at you. So yes, you can target interventions, modify effect sizes, and do both if you want, and all within a Shiny app. And that's it there. It's still under development, partly to put in the Stress Less digital intervention, but we understand how it works, but we haven't actually put together a user's guide for it yet. We did put together a user's guide for a previous one, the Knowledge Lab model, and we can build off that a little bit, but there's a few little quirks in here that we'll need to put develop a user guide for, but it's there for if people want to have a look and can get in touch with me. I didn't put my email actually, but get in touch with Martin or Natalia. I'm sure they can put you on to me, but that's pretty much what I want to cover. Thank you very much. This is huge change for childhood obesity. That is, exactly.
That was a comment mostly, sorry.
I think there's that's a huge change and a relatively short-term change as well.
True.
So I have to get back in touch with Rachel Taylor actually, because I think they've run some analyses on later impacts to see whether they flow through. Interestingly, with the model for smoking pregnancy, the evidence out there is that whatever impact there is of smoking pregnancy on obesity lasts way into the future, so into early adulthood as well. So that's the way we've programmed it. Okay, you mentioned some ministries using microsimulation models. How common is usage amongst ministries to test their policy interventions? How can the models that you mentioned be used by ministries? Are they interested? Okay, how common is usage across ministries to test their policy interventions? I don't actually know. I think that, again, the Tawa one is the one that's most used about, you know, how policies that affect taxes, for instance, and transfers may affect individuals and how much it's going to cost. Can the models that I mentioned be used by ministries? Absolutely. That's the whole point of putting them into a model that anyone can use, anyone can go to and use it. Are they interested? I'll have to present it to them. When we developed the MEL-C model, the Knowledge Lab model, I went down and had regular meetings with different government agencies about those models. But I don't think, and they weren't used. So we showed them how they could be used and developed them and pointed them to them, but they weren't used. And to some extent, they might be because they weren't modeling things that they were interested in particularly. So it wasn't the policy concern of the time. What have we got there now? We've got a sleep intervention. We've got the Better Start Literacy approach. The Better Start Literacy approach has received funding to for sort of a rollout, more or less, across the country. So you'd think the government, or parts of the government, should be interested in that. I hope that answers your questions. Can the IDI be used with your microsim expertise? Seems like that is both a policy and research advantage that you have internationally. It can. So there was a lot of, I think the MSIM model uses the IDI, but a lot of the models that I didn't cover use the IDI. So there's a Oranga Tamariki model, there's a justice model, there was various models, as you would know, Peter, that they put at tenders for during the previous national government. But yeah, so people are using the IDI, and then there's a question of how you do it. Do you do all your analysis within the IDI to get your transition probabilities, for instance, and then take all of that out and put it in a user-friendly interface that we've got so people can use it, and that's probably the model I favor, and that means it can be more widely used, or you can develop everything. You could set up a microsimulation model in the IDI. I don't know how MSIM, for instance, I think that uses the IDI. I don't know how MSIM works. I have a feeling it is outside the IDI. It might be touched on actually in that that working paper that I mentioned before by Sarah Pinto and Verity Warren. But you're right, that's something that we've got that other places don't. The question was, I guess, do I know if if it can be used to predict things such as people's political behavior? And I don't actually know whether it has been used for that, but it wouldn't surprise me. And I think a quick Googling might just answer the question. Okay. What other policies are you considering simulating in the future? Okay, I'll stop and answer that question first. For this, no more, because it's very much tied to the Better Start National Science Challenge. But what I showed you, it's modular, essentially. You can keep adding things in there, and then you're simulating it at that point. So there's potential to do that. Is there any potential for linking with other New Zealand models? That would depend, I think, on the structure of the models and the people that we're simulating. So we don't think I went into this in great detail, but we have a synthetic population of 10,000 children who match the children born, who was age 0 essentially, born in 2013. So that's who we model, and it's what's called a closed cohort. So it's just them, no one enters and no one leaves, and that's, you know, to some extent unrealistic, because you've got immigration, you've got children moving out, and you've got children dying in some cases. So there'd have to be, I mean, it's certainly possible, but you'd have to think through, and it can't just plug in now. I think that's maybe what I'm getting at. You'd have to rejig things. One thing is causality. If your comparison groups differ by key confounders, how do you fix that? The question is, you don't. The approach is you, if you're concerned that there might be a degree of confounding, you can change the size of the estimate. So if you think, and actually taking a step back as well, Peter, one of the that was one of our justifications for using systematic reviews as part of the knowledge lab model, is that in theory, they're best estimates that have taken account of confounders and averaged across different studies that have done things. So if someone says, "Oh, that's rubbish. This is full of confounding," I think it's only 25% of the size of what you think it is. Fine, adjust it so that it is 5% of the size. So as I say, it's not a replacement for epidemiology or the social science work that has been done. It uses that information and puts it into a model. If the information is wrong, you need different information, basically. And that's one of the reasons we developed as part of this, the ability to change estimates, which we talked about and always put in the too hard a basket when we were working on these sort of 5 to 10 years ago. Gilbert Wong, can you microsimulate natural disasters? I imagine you can. You'd simulate, that would be an interesting simulation, actually. You could simulate several things. You could simulate the effect, the geological effect of the natural disaster, or geographic effect of or climate effect of the natural disaster. And you know, you imagine having a model of New Zealanders live where New Zealanders live, and then you can simulate the impact of people, and what if they stayed home, and what if they went to higher ground, or whatever. So yes, you certainly can. Again, whether anyone has, it's one of those things where I think they probably have, but I don't actually, you know, I can't give you an example. Yeah, Peter says, in the early days, we tried to start a regular meeting in Wellington of people interested in microsim. Yeah, we did. That was arranged through us and NZIER, actually. And that's what I wondered whether that sort of thing might happen when Social Wellbeing Agency basically asked people, you know, tell us about microsimulation models and the status of them. So sort of a community of practice, if you like. That wouldn't be a bad thing to start up again, actually, because you know, government is often said, I'm not saying anything new here, government agencies are sometimes siloed from each other. And being in academia, we sometimes siloed from government agencies. So a community of practice wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea. I don't know who out there is listening and may get on board with that, but yeah, good idea. Upcoming policy intervention, for instance, the upcoming smoking leave. You could do, yeah, and that's exactly the sort of thing that it could be used for. Yeah, I mean, if what you'd have to do there is have some estimates or a range of estimates of what the impact on, let's say, smoking rates was, or maybe the impact on other things. That's the other thing about the microsimulation. It doesn't have to be linear. You can simulate all sorts of types of things. Could you create a real-like sample in IDI with characters of interest and request output? No, not really. So I'll take you a little bit through this process, and this is why I thanked Chris Ball, actually, is Eileen, simulated individuals within the data lab. So we randomly selected 10,000 individuals, and we matched them to their 20 closest neighbors. So you've got 21 people. And then for each characteristic we were interested in, we took a mean. So for binary characteristics, that's a mean of 0s and 1s. So are they male or female, that sort of thing. And for continuous characteristics, it's an actual mean. Why did we do it that way? Because everything released from the data lab, all means released from the data lab must have at least 20 in the denominator, and the denominator must be divisible by 3. 21 is the smallest number above 20 that's divisible by 3. This is the method that Chris Ball came up with. So we released that, and there was a few other, and I can't remember what they were, but there's a few other hoops that we jumped through to show that it didn't look like real data. So essentially, we didn't release a synthetic base file from the data lab. What we released is the ability to generate synthetic data from the data lab. So what we had is 10,000 individuals with a probability of being each thing, and then we could roll a dice and give them that thing. So yes, and there's a few other parties, Alex Wong being an example, Mariana Picar being another example, who are investigating the types of synthetic data that you can get out of the IDI. And I believe also that Māori language model, that also involved getting synthetic data out of the IDI. So yeah, so that's what we did. And I thought it was a really clever idea that Chris Ball developed, I think, for his PhD. So it's all within R. So it's an R package called Summario, which was developed by Oliver Mannion and developed further by Jessica McClay and Kevin Chang. And it's then displayed just in R Shiny. And actually, I think I won't go back there, but there is a link which we might have actually suppressed while we're still developing things. But there is a link to the code. There's probably still a link to Summario because it is an R package that was developed by Oliver originally and added to by Kevin and others, Jessica. So yeah, so it's all done with an R essentially. When Oliver first started doing this, it was done in Java, and then he just discovered he bit by bit transferred more over to R and discovered basically R can do everything. And once we're in R, we can then display it in a Shiny app. Thank you, everyone.